How did your hometown come to be? In Chicago, railroads and industry made the city boom. Blues and jazz made it sing. But there's a lesser-known force, another spike in the timeline, the race riots of 1919. In the wake of more than a week of violence, Chicago looked different, it felt different. And if you talk to some residents, they'll tell you the summer of 1919 still explains Chicago today. Lake Michigan is a magnet during Chicago summers, and the summer of 1919 was no different in that way, but it would be a summer like no one had ever seen. Neighborhoods across the city were sharply divided along racial lines. Tens of thousands of African Americans had moved to the city in that decade, most settling in an area called the Black Belt, later renamed Bronzeville. They fled racial violence in the South and came in search of jobs to support the war effort. Other African Americans served in that war, the Great War, World War I. Their bravery in battle earned them medals of honor and helped secure victory. Back home in Chicago, segregation was illegal, but resources were scarce, racism rampant, and anti-Black violence commonplace. Unofficial lines separated white and Black jobs, neighborhoods, and beaches along the lake. I visited one of those beaches with Erica Griffin, the Director of Education at the DuSable Museum of African American History. She told me how long-simmering tensions exploded on a hot July day.
On that fateful day, July the 27th, 1919, right here, not far from this spot where we're standing, a young man named Eugene Williams, actually a teen, he was 17. Eugene Williams was with his friends. They'd created a raft. They were trying to escape the unseasonably warm day, and they took their raft and they were floating not far from here and lost track of where they were and unfortunately floated over to that white side of the beach, crossing that color barrier that they knew was there, but there was no physical marker for it. Once they crossed, the beachgoers on the shore started to jeer at them. Stones were thrown in their direction.
They can't steer this raft back or anything.
Absolutely.
So they're basically trapped.
Absolutely. No way to steer the raft back, so they had no choice but to keep going.
As stones flew toward them, Eugene Williams slipped under the water and drowned. Some newspapers and a friend who was with Eugene that day reported he'd been hit by a stone. The coroner claimed that Eugene had drowned from exhaustion. One way or another, the rocks drove Eugene Williams under the water. The white police officer refused to arrest the man who threw the stones.
By this time, both Black and white beachgoers were corralling in anger at the 29th Street beach, and they erupted. There was a massive outbreak of anger on both sides right here on the beach, and everyone was ordered to disband. So the Black population went back into Bronzeville, where the majority of them lived, and on their heels were members of the athletic clubs, which we would today consider to be a white gang. These athletic clubs were made up of working class, a lot of immigrant populations, a lot of Irish, and they came and poured into Bronzeville, wreaking havoc, looting homes, throwing stones, breaking windows, trying to assert their dominance, so to speak, over anyone that they could find. And this sort of violence went on for days, about a week's worth of violence.
Over the course of that week, violence spread beyond Bronzeville. Black and white people were attacked as they traveled to work at stockyards or restaurants. White gangs fired guns as they drove through Black neighborhoods. They set fires that spread and left over 1,000 Black and Lithuanian people homeless. The police did little to curb the violence. For Black veterans, the attacks were an affront to the sacrifices they had made overseas.
The African American population didn't just lay down and accept what was happening. They chose to fight back. And a lot of the people in service to the community during the riots were those African American soldiers who had returned home.
So did the riot ultimately end because of the National Guard, or did it kind of burn itself out, or what happened?
You know, I would say both of those things. So yes, the National Guard helped to quell a lot of the violence, but believe it or not, the rain came in and that sort of not only cooled down the burning homes, but cooled down a lot of those tensions as well. So the entire outcome is something that the city has to reconcile with, the city has to remember, and the city also has to add to this amazing narrative of what Chicago is. It is trade, it is commerce and the railroads, but it is also the story of the race riot of 1919.
Chicago was not the only city that saw violence in the summer of 1919. As Black veterans returned home and as Black families moved north and west, racism pushed back at every turn. In at least 25 cities and towns, white mobs injured and killed Black people and destroyed their property. This season of violence came to be called the Red Summer. Though the Chicago riots were not unique, the city is unusual in its recognition of this history. In 2019, historical and cultural institutions from across Chicago came together to learn about a history and a legacy that has shaped the city for more than 100 years. The Newberry Library was a leader, organizing a series of community conversations. I visited the library to meet Liesl Olson, Director of Chicago Studies at the Newberry, to learn what role the media played in documenting the riots and shaping the public's understanding of the violence.
So this is the media coverage in 1919. It's newspapers, and Chicago is really a center for journalism and print culture. We have many, many newspapers coming out of Chicago every day. The Chicago Defender, the national race weekly that is published out of Chicago, started in 1905.
Avidly read all over the country.
Avidly read all over the country. The Defender is a major influencer in terms of getting African-American migrants from the rural South to move to the North. And so the Chicago Defender is published once a week, which is important to keep in mind because the riots start on a Sunday, and the Defender isn't going to press till Saturday. So in some ways, it's these other newspapers, the Chicago Tribune, which is published twice a day, Chicago Daily News, but there's also this need to cover them from an African-American perspective too, and so the Defender is really key there. There is a letter from the Chicago Defender that the Tribune publishes in this issue, and it's the Defender thanking the Tribune for its coverage. Right down here, Voice of the People. And the title of this letter is A Sedative for Race Prejudice. Your treatment of the race riot and your edition of Today was marked with fairness to our people and showed a lack of coloring so often found in articles dealing with such situations. Our paper for years has worked assiduously to bring about a better understanding between our white and colored citizens, and we are glad to have your assistance in the work. So that's from Alfred Anderson from the Chicago Defender. So, you know, again, the Defender barely even gets to press during the riots. They know that African Americans in Chicago are relying on publications like the Tribune for coverage.
So I'm assuming that is sincere, but also we hope you'll continue.
Absolutely, a gentle prod.
Yeah.
You know, we're reading. Let's keep it fair and objective.
The Chicago Defender had reason to encourage the Tribune to be objective. Newspapers sensationalized and even fabricated some stories about the riots. But photography opened another avenue for the public to understand what was happening in Bronzeville and beyond. Jun Fujita, a young Japanese-American photographer and poet, worked for the Daily News. He set out to document the true story unfolding on the streets.
Partly because he is neither white nor black, he's somehow able to get access to the violence in ways that other people could not. So to take a look in his photographs, a few of them are over here. You'll see this is a photograph of, you know, a white mob who has looted this home, and they're very celebratory, right? They've taken over this house. They're happy. They're glad that they've you know, victoriously smashed those windows, taken over things. They're holding things out of the house.
Yeah, the children with them, celebrating the moment with
I think the young children. I mean, it's crushing. Here you see a kind of standoff, right? This is when the Illinois State Guard comes in. the gazes, the way in which people are looking at each other eye to eye, right? I mean, all the gazes are straight at this African-American man in the center, and then these two men looking on, like, what's happening here? Right. You know, and where are the sympathies of this photograph? It's really hard to know.
Striking how the black man's not backing down, even though the other guys have guns, right?
That's absolutely
it's like
right.
There's a kind of dignity to it.
And he's the tallest man in the photograph,
right?
And there are many other fugitive photographs. So he was able to really get inside the riots.
100 years after the riots, Chicagoans are finding new ways to interpret and understand the documents and photos published during and after the violence. Eve Ewing, a sociologist, wrote a book of poetry titled 1919, inspired by an unexpected source.
This is a printed version of a 1922 report called The Negro in Chicago that was issued after the 1919 race riots that took place here in Chicago. And it was put together by a committee of notable black men from Chicago and notable white men from Chicago. Wow. I always joke that women hadn't been invented yet at that point. And they were tasked with figuring out how and why the 1919 race riot that happened here that was so violent and left such an impact on the city, they were tasked with figuring out why that happened and to think through the kind of root causes and conditions that led to this eruption of violence. And the thing is, once they sat down and started to answer that question, they realized that in order to do so, what they really had to figure out was what was the state of black life in Chicago at that time. Hence, we get this incredibly direct title, The Negro in Chicago. And as a poet, I found that pretty compelling.
Do you have poems that are built around?
Yes.
Would you mind choosing one?
Yeah. So each poem in this book, 1919, begins with a passage from The Negro in Chicago. So this poem begins with this passage from the appendix, which is stating the circumstances of death of each of the people who died, who were killed in the riot. Number 14. Samuel Bass, on account of the streetcar strike, was walking the 5 1/2 miles from his work to his home when a gang of white men knocked him down 3 times and cut gashes in his nose and cheeks with their shoes. Bass hid behind freight cars till a Jewish peddler took him in his cart to State Street. A doctor was visited, but when he learned that Bass had no money, he turned him away without treatment. He was picked up by a passing patrol and taken to the hospital, where his treatment was cursory. Apparently he recovered, but in 2 weeks gave evidence of a hemorrhage on the brain, from which he died September 5th. This poem is called This is a Map. This is a map of my city. Here are the places in my city where I dare not go. Here is where the electric wires gave out, and here is where I still had to make it home. And here is the first mile, where I whistled the way my granny taught me to keep away the haints. And here is where a baby waved to me from a window. And here is the second mile, where I heard the calls. And on this map, there is no third mile in this, my city, where I first prayed to die. And then, hearing a single cardinal over the din of their threats, changed my mind and prayed to live. And this is a map of my neighbor's city, where he traces a way through the mud each day, the squeal of old wood on iron heralding his arrival, a king of the streets, a conquering hero of nowhere. And this is a map of my body. This is the blood of my rivers. This is the bruise of my marshland. This is the sinew of my furthest ridge. And this is a map of the railroad. And if I could stand and walk, I could make it all the way back to my granny, pinching snuff and humming. And if she looked up, she would say, "Boy, my baby, where you been all this time?"
So where do you find the strength to imagine yourself into that and then to translate it into words that speak to us?
That's such a great question. I think that what was so striking to me about this report and about this story is that so many people didn't know much about it, and I didn't know much about it, and I'm an interested party, right? And I know a lot and care a lot about Chicago history. And so what struck me about this story was how much we had forgotten that has happened in the very places we inhabit. And so to your point of, finding the strength to do that, I think it's my obligation. I think it's your obligation, if you know a good story, to tell it, if you know an important story, to tell it. And I see myself, my work is in the lineage of Afrofuturism, so I think about time as being very nonlinear. And therefore, I think about my own work as being one piece in a very large project that started way before I was born and is going to continue way after I'm gone. So I'm just trying to, plod along in my little way and make it easier for somebody else who comes after.
On July 27, 2019, Chicagoans across the city marked the 100th anniversary of Eugene Williams' death. One group toured Bronzeville on bikes, viewing sites that established Bronzeville as the center of Black life in 1919. An integrated group of cyclists crossed the so-called dead line that had marked the division between Black and Irish American neighborhoods. That word, deadline, wasn't hyperbole. For decades here, white residents had threatened African Americans with violence if they dared to move close by. Threats were carried out, too. Dozens of firebombs claimed lives and damaged homes. After the riots, real estate agents encouraged white property owners to sign agreements prohibiting the resale or renting of homes to Black families. Then, in the 1930s, the federal government hired real estate agents here to solidify discrimination street by street. Inspectors judged every block for the risk of writing a mortgage there. Soothing blues and green shaded neighborhoods of white people whose ancestors were from Northern and Western Europe. Areas dominated by more recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe as well as from Ireland were judged a cautious yellow. Majority Black neighborhoods were rated worst of all and shaded a dangerous red. For most Black Chicagoans, getting a mortgage to buy a home was next to impossible. Integrated life in the city was almost unheard of. On the 100th anniversary of the riots, Chicago residents returned to the beach where the riots began to remember this history and to defy it. I met Jefferson Pender, a performance artist and professor, to learn about his work to make history tangible to Chicago residents today. So performance art, what is that?
What is performance art?
Yeah.
If I could figure that out, I'd let you know. But I'm still struggling to kind of like get my hands around it because I think that it's such a long tradition of working. And I think people were doing it before it was coined performance art.
Right.
So it's like, how do I insert myself into this tradition? So it is what I say it is, I mean, it's somehow it's like it's opportunity to use aspects of, I guess, what people would consider to be typical or traditional performance with the everyday.
So its transience is a part of its nature?
I think so. I mean, I think that's where the power is. It's somehow that you can identify it, that somehow it's slipping in between the cracks.
So why did that seem like a good match for 1919?
Because I think that there's a particular kind of mirroring that happens with history, that there's a repetition of the past. And so what better way of looking at the past and looking at the everyday? This idea of this young boy, this young man just floating in the, on a flotational device in the lake, who was in a state of relaxation, having to be ready for an onslaught of violence. That stuck with me. July 27th, we did a piece titled Float. And Float was a memorial to Eugene Williams, who died in the lake 100 years ago. So we planted ourselves in that site, in that location, in the water, thinking about Eugene and in that moment. Then what was, I guess, really kind of moving more toward the spiritual was the voice of this woman who's 107 years old, who remembers the experience and is really just speaking from the heart about what that experience was like for her in 1919.
I saw my uncle say these words, "Here they come." It meant the white people were coming down 35th Street with loaded guns. And that is the beginning of the race riot.
The piece is titled Float, but what was happening in the moment that we didn't expect is there was a lot of drifting and movement. And what I think where that hit home is we realized that it wasn't too different than the experience Eugene Williams must have felt when he was on a flotational device and he found himself in the white section of the beach. This is something we hadn't planned. There was a lot of tension that, you know, if you let go of one another, they're gonna drift off into the lake. So somehow ensuring that there's power means that there has to be a connection. And to see people connected this way, it was a cathartic experience for certain people.
It's hard to find any marker or memorial for the 23 black people and 15 white people who died in the riots, but a group of Chicago residents is aiming to change that. I went to the Harold Washington Library to meet Peter Cole and Franklin Cozy Gay. They're both professors. Peter teaches history, and Franklin runs a youth violence prevention center. Together with community organizations and young people, they're aiming to bring the riots back into public consciousness.
Forgetting has failed. Forgetting hasn't worked. Anyone in 2019 can just look around and say, okay, racial injustice and racial inequality persists. The question is why? And part of the answer is a failure to understand our history.
What we're experiencing in Chicago is no different than what we've experienced in this nation. There needs to be a lot of acknowledgement of the past, and until we do that, there's difficulty with building up trust.
Do you find people resist this idea? I mean, why can't we just let it go? You know, why dig up all this splinter from 100 years ago? Do you run into resistance?
No, you know, so I think that there's a demand to increase the dialogue, to increase the narrative around this. And so it's important for the community to say, hey, if there is an origin story of someone and a group of young men that played a role that were in quote-unquote athletic clubs that everyone sees through the lines that those were actually gangs,
right.
Why is our community being over-criminalized? Why are we being locked up? Why has incarceration rates gone up by 600%? But essentially what it is about is that 1919 race riots is an origin story for why Chicago looks the way that it does.
So talk about the public art project that you have in mind. What are you imagining?
I've come to appreciate that modern Germany is doing a lot to grapple with its history of atrocity, also specifically the Holocaust. And if you walk down the streets of Berlin or Hamburg or other German cities, you can find small brass plaques embedded into the sidewalks outside of the homes of Holocaust victims, and that's called Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones in English, created by a German artist, Günter Demnig. The idea of dispersed public art in order to attack historical amnesia is not unique, but it is, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people's, brilliant. And that we could essentially harness that idea and apply it in different ways to our context in Chicago, and perhaps, along with other movements, push in the direction of racial justice instead of trying to imagine and hope that we'll move in that direction without actually doing anything.
The markers that Peter and Franklin are envisioning have not yet been created or installed, but one will appear here, steps outside of the Harold Washington Library in the Loop. Here, Robert Williams, a black man from Mississippi, was chased down by a mob of white men and killed. A couple of blocks away, another marker will be installed where Paul Hardwick, a black man from Georgia who worked as a waiter, was killed. As visitors head to the Art Institute of Chicago or to the start of Route 66, or as locals head to work or school, a marker in the sidewalk may catch their eye. It's these kinds of changes in the landscape that help shape our understanding of the places we call home. For Peter and Franklin, and so many others who work to remember this history, hope lies in the promise that young people will know this history. Over the summer, a group of high schoolers took part in a program organized by young Chicago authors. They learned about the riots and visited the Newberry Library to view archival evidence firsthand. Then, the students wrote poetry connecting the history of the riots to their own lives. The poets premiered their works at the Harold Washington Library, speaking urgently and asking us to listen.
Chicago been seeing blue and red lights and knowing to take flight. Chicago's been 911, 911 what?
James Crawford, come child, please. Eugene is okay. He is making a place for Emmett and Marcia and all the others who will be found in the water.
We've lost our home like an earring, accidentally torn away by a rip current, and now the ocean gets to own an extra pearl.
Write poems to be proud of, poems that can drain the lake of dead bodies and wash the blood off the rocks. Poems be a life raft.
Ignorance will evaporate like water. Take racism and discrimination and homophobia with you. You'll never see it coming.
Chicago's been scared of us. They know what we would do if we was united, so they make barriers. We a problem for them. They divide us, so we take care of us. Chicago's been showing me the realities of America.
Remembering the riots, remembering the awfulness that we can do to each other. It helps us focus on the need to do better, to build a future where we're all welcome, where we're all safe.